Hi guys, welcome or welcome back. If you don't know me, my name is Catherine, and if you do know me, yeah, you can probably tell I'm tired. But either way, I'm so grateful that you can make it here or make it back from wherever it is on the internet that you happen to drop in from. Okay, so what I think is wise, what I'm not going to do in a discussion like this, and what I feel you shouldn't do in discussions like this, is patronize the community of concern. Like, we're not talking about a barely literate female cult of unserious readers here, without getting into the weeds of what it really means to be a serious reader. But at the same time, I'm not about to defend this book, and I'm definitely not about to defend this author. And if by miracle, and quite honestly by blessing, you've managed to escape what it is, we're talking about the rumored, but more so planned, I think, film adaptation of the book Haunting Adeline.
You are directly contributing to and I am done coddling you book talk gooners defending this book in my comment. The commenter was right. You are directly contributing to culture. We're not romanticizing sexual assault while you call a book about a woman with a gun where she ends up with the romance. You call it that. Nobody calls it that but you.
If your claim is that Haunting Adeline does not romanticize, then why is Zaid Meadows consistently hailed as people's book boyfriend? Why are fans commenting on the author's page to ensure that the casting of the actor for Zaid is hot enough? Calling a character who violently violated the main female character your book boyfriend does seem like we are in fact romanticizing a.
So when this movie comes out, and if every single detail is exactly the same, and I see people loving and creating edits of a literal rapist, I'm gonna have to jump off a cliff. I'm gonna have to. And I think the decision to make this into a movie was a terrible decision. I don't know what made them think it was a good one.
Dark romance is a subgenre of romance fiction, right? That deliberately indulges taboo experiences, severe power imbalances, morally enigmatic characters. The elements of relationship featured in these types of stories are necessarily that of some violation, okay? I'm talking stalking, coercion, abuse, just some sort of toxicity happening there. And it always builds up to some form of a happily ever after or happily for now type ending, if you know what I mean. The novel follows this girl, her name is Adeline, and she gets entangled with this individual, the infamous Zaid Meadows, and he is this vigilante essentially dedicated to dismantling human trafficking networks while simultaneously violating every moral, legal, ethical, and interpersonal boundary of, Adeline's in his obsessive pursuit of her.
Dark romance people, leave horror out of it. Leave us out. We cannot be compared to that. No. Horror is horror because it's deemed morally and societally bad and wrong and villainous. Your fantasy is being romanticized. We are not the same.
One of the primary criticisms against the novel is not merely that it is not just a contemplation of these often sexually traumatic exposures, but because it requires, from you as a reader, some imaginative posture of tolerance within these abusive dynamics in order to enjoy the plot elements. The novel needs you actually to split your moral identity between fictional reality and lived reality where, you would otherwise enforce a harsher standard of contempt. This is important, I believe, for a reader's gradual accommodation to assist enjoyment and eventually, at some point, even eroticization of the novel's more dehumanizing elements. Many readers summarize the story admittedly reductively, but I think revealingly, as the tale of a woman who is repeatedly violated, until at the end of the story, she realizes she actually liked it all along. Now, whether that synopsis perfectly captures, every narrative nuance is for my purposes, almost secondary to the anthropological issue I seek to address, but I will definitely return to that a little bit later in this video.
H.D Carlton just posted a video as a response to everyone hating against Haunting Adeline becoming a movie. So let's talk about it, because it needs to be talked about. She wants to talk about it, let's talk about it. First thing she does, she opens with, "I'm sorry for what you had to experience this past week because you're a fan." Ultimately, that's immediately a sympathy ploy. That's to keep you drawn in, because what you've had to experience this week, respectfully, is because you're defending a book that is controversial for being about. Then she goes on to say, "The majority of people who have an issue with this book have an issue with Zaid's hypocrisy." You can't replace the term and sexual assault with hypocrisy. Zayd is not a hypocrite. He is a... She then goes on to say that people who are fighting her in the comments and fighting people claim to care about those who are sexually assaulted, and yet we're arguing against this movie. And she says that this movie is part of how they choose to heal. I'm a sexual assault survivor. I've almost been. And I get that people read dark romance to cope. Okay, I get it. But when have we ever seen coping mechanisms made into a movie? And I am saying this from the bottom of my heart and from someone who has been there. Respectfully, if you're reading dark romance to cope, it's not healthy. It's really not. She does say in her video that there are therapists that will argue it's healthy, and respectfully, H.D Carlton, I want to see that list. I want to see the people who are scientifically saying that reading this is healthy for these survivors. You can have any I can't talk, I'm sorry. You can have any coping mechanism you want. Some people harm themselves, other people go and get drunk, some people go and read dark romance. That doesn't mean that mechanism is healthy. And that doesn't mean that that mechanism should be made into a movie. In no world should a movie be made so that trauma survivors feel like they're healing. That has never happened. And if it has, please, tell me in the comments when it has happened.
What complicates this discussion even further is H.D Carlton's own public testimony as it concerns the novel's origins. Responding to criticism, she wrote that she herself is a survivor of domestic violence, child abuse, and that Haunting Adeline was written as a way for her to process her experiences. And so I read that, and genuinely I do have sympathy. That disclosure does alter the moral complexion, I think, of this conversation. Pain indeed insists on being intended to. I think the origins of certain creative endeavors actually do rationalize a space for compassion, but it does not mean that sympathizers cannot have a problem with how you process your pain if that processing, right? If whatever it is you conclude, right, from your processing does not remain a private exercise. You know what I mean? If your processing is not private, then it can be evaluated publicly. The means by which we metabolize suffering are never entirely private, especially when they are then, translated into public artifacts consumed by millions. It is essentially what I spoke to when I was reviewing Janet McCurdy's Half His Age. Trauma may contextualize a work without exhausting our responsibility as the audience to evaluate its effects. Being abused is, in one sense, kind of like having a hot potato, okay, or a live grenade or a bomb thrust into your hands without your consent. It's not fair, obviously, and it's not your fault, but somehow what it does to you and how it reconfigures your behavior is your responsibility to bear. The injustice, though, is entirely with the person who placed it there. And the tragedy of humanity, is that pain multiplies and perpetuates itself precisely when the wounded, however understandably, pass forward whatever they themselves received. Unfortunately, victims receive, they inherit what they never chose. But the dignity of moral agency, even in suffering, I think lies in refusing to pass forward that burden, refusing to pass forward that pain unchanged to somebody else. Guys, I'm not a victim blaming. I'm not saying that this is a fair reality. It is by every measure a frustrating reality, but we have to get to a point where we recognize that the only place where cycles of violence have ever ended is where somebody absorbed their momentum without reproducing them. But if we never recognize that, you guys, we end up bleeding on people, on innocent people who never cut us. It's why, and I've seen this happen in real time, you may have a victim be unbelievably dismissive to the pains of people abused under the same violations, or the same victim may become increasingly intolerant, aggressively advocative for better protections. One may develop under these circumstances dissociative fractures where, somehow you are more than willing to accept for yourself what you would never tolerate for other people. Dissociations can occur on multiple levels, and it's essentially like the fracturing of moral identity across different representations of yourself. You don't maintain the same standard of patience, of tolerance, of conviction with other people or even with yourself. And it is honestly for that reason why, or one of the reasons why, I don't question readers' capacity to compartmentalize.
If you don't like it, just don't read it. Or if you don't like it, don't watch it. Guys, Things happen to the entire world all because we're just not paying attention. This is the kind of content and material that should not be mainstream. I don't know what there is to be so controversial about that. To make the argument, oh, you guys weren't like this when 50 Shades of Grey came out. Okay, let's analyze 50 Shades of Grey, right? One, it was a fringe book at the start. When it became a movie, became super, super mainstream. I can tell you, as a high schooler, I had no idea what S&M was until 50 Shades of Grey came out, like the movie was, and then everyone wanted to talk about it, right? Some materials, some ideas become mainstream because it is in a video format. Let's just get that started, right? Now, Haunting Adeline, the material in that book, at least 50 Shades of Grey was like somewhat consensual, right? Haunting Adeline, you want to tell me that was consensual? It's about a girl raped over and over again until she somehow likes it. Now, with material like that becoming mainstream due to visual media, like a movie, for instance, a wide movie release, somehow that's okay. If you don't like it, just don't watch it. I hate this kind of intellectualism where you're like, yeah, all values are equal, and somehow if you don't like it, just don't pay attention to it, yada, yada, yada. Some material, some ideas should not be mainstream. Some stuff should not be made into movies. Some people should not be exposed to this kind of stuff. We already have reports of people who are like elementary, middle school, who are exposed to pornography and do awful things to their classmates, right? Now you want to be like, yeah, we actually need more pornography like that out there, and we're going to make a movie out of it. And if you don't like that, you're not a real feminist, or you just need to let people enjoy things and yada, yada, yada. No. I'm actually getting viscerally angry about this.
I question something subtler, okay? Whether prolonged imaginative residence within certain moral atmospheres trains sympathies whose cumulative consequences we rarely perceive until they have already become long part of the architecture through which we understand love, power, responsibility, and even ourselves. So when we speak about compartmentalization, you guys, I feel that we often flatten this conversation into a bit of a false dichotomy, like either fiction is, morally inert, or like on the other extreme, fiction deterministically manufactures criminals, which obviously I think is like absolutely, like it's that is nonsense. Certain narratives do repeatedly ask the imagination to become emotionally fluent in relational architectures that, outside of fiction, we would immediately recognize as profoundly dehumanizing. Every generation, at least, with common sense, has recognized that there exists a distinction between depicting evil and like inviting psychological participation within it. Very few readers finish reading Crime and Punishment wanting to become more like Raskolnikov, okay? And that is because Dostoevsky deliberately structures interpretation against murder. The reader does not inhabit indulgence because the point is not to become less estranged to evil. Likewise, in scripture, David commits adultery, but the narrative does not eroticize it, right? It burdens it. Amnon, David's son, Tamar, but the narrative, it never invites this crude fascination, right? It leaves devastation deliberately, like the moral architecture necessarily remains intact. And then you look at the cross, right? One of the most violent spectacles in history. And yet, Christian theology never invites believers to admire the violence, like in and of itself, but rather to admire the self-giving love that enters violence in order to exhaust its claims. One of the central criticisms leveled against Haunting Adeline is precisely that its emotional trajectory moves towards a slow accommodation of particularly in the interest of a great many things, okay? Psychological exploration, perhaps some sort of catharsis, some sort of processing. There's been a lot of argument for and against this book.
I'm not in the business of coddling women and telling them that the ways that they're coping with their sexual assault is a good thing. It can be your coping mechanism. That still doesn't make it right. You're still contributing to culture, and you're still reading books about a girl that falls in love with her rapist. That is not good. And trying to justify romanticizing, being like, well, this is my coping mechanism and this is how I'm healing what happened to me, even though me romanticizing it is going to negatively impact and influence other populations of women, it's still okay because it's how I cope and it's how I'm healing. There's no accountability. And again, I'm not saying that you need to take accountability for what happened to you. I'm saying you need to take accountability for how you're coping with this. If the way that you're coping with it is harming other people and perpetuating more culture, you need to take accountability for that.
But yes, it has been summarized as, and I quote, a woman repeatedly violated until, she learns that a part of her enjoyed it all along. Like that synopsis exists for a reason. The question is never whether stories contain darkness. I think all stories in some sense do. We need to be asking ourselves where that darkness is requiring our affections to rest. There's, I've referenced him before, Bessel van der Kolk. He observes that trauma victims frequently recreate aspects of their traumatic experiences, of the dynamics that they have endured, without consciously desiring the trauma in and of itself. This does not mean, obviously, that survivors secretly desire somehow what happened to them, but it also doesn't blame them. I think it just means that injury can disorder the very mechanisms by which recognizable safety is actually contemplated. Okay, it's not shameful, and this is where I begin to get really irritated at how certain extremes of this conversation either blame the victim or create some issue of integrity with people who use these stories in order to process, while still recognizing that the processing, the means through which you're processing, is not actually healthy. Often these dark romance narratives do contain an arc where, the victim or usually it's a female protagonist, is able to take back her power and is able to overcome, and that's hope. And I think that's one of the reasons I think a lot of women are drawn to these stories, besides the other aspect, but focusing on the former, focusing on the hope. Okay, I think that hope is one of the draws, one of the pulls. But the narrative trajectory to this hope, to this finding yourself, finding your agency, right, at the end of the day, is muffled beneath all of this. I want to use a delicate word here. Poison, in a way that doesn't even feel strong enough, because some of this stuff is so vile. Anyway, my point is to get to the end, you have a singular redeeming thread, right, of hope, of reclaiming agency, of finding your identity, but it's surrounded by all of these other threads of just muck. You know what I mean? It's a bit like pharmacon, okay? It's an ancient concept, but it simultaneously means medicine, poison, and remedy. Exactly the same object, right, but different outcome. Plato, I think, used it. Jacques Derrida famously explored it. The ambiguity in utility and, the degree to which it is integrated into human need is so important to recognize, right? Because stories are, in a sense, pharmaca, right? They heal, but they can also poison, often simultaneously. And so the question never is, is fiction or are certain forms of fiction dangerous, right? We've always known that will always be the case. The real question becomes, dangerous to what end?
Because he's hot and sexually desirable, his behavior is part of his appeal. It makes him more attractive that he is those things. So you don't have to change. This is what I'm scared of, the narrative that it's pushing, is that you don't have to change your behavior. You just have to be more physically attractive. No. I'm really scared for the red pill content consumers.
And then comes the concern around men apparently taking what we as women have managed to claim for ourselves, and how making content like this, like Haunting Adeline mainstream, compromises that effort. Women have, unfortunately, I think, inherited a terribly complicated relationship with power, because it has been, so frequently even just historically, used against us. Consequently, I think power is reimagined as this morally neutral currency that simply needs to be reclaimed and redirected. And obviously, when it comes to this, when it comes to men and women and what we consume, there is a double standard. Yes, there have been forms of male entertainment that glorify dehumanization, brutality, abuse on scales that absolutely do dwarf contemporary romance fiction. That hypocrisy should be confronted wherever it does appear, when it does appear, because because it always does appear. But in whatever name you push this content, we are not, as women, equalizing the field here.
Oh, Game of Thrones, it depicted grape, and these movies depicted grape. Where was the uproar for those? Two wrongs don't make a right. Two wrongs don't make a right. And most importantly, a lot of the movies and TV shows that you guys are mentioning in books are not marketed as romance books. Again, they're not in the dark romance/romance genre. Two wrongs don't make a freaking right. How can you sit here and read a passage from Haunting Adeline that says, I know I took advantage of her several times on several occasions, I think it's okay?
The fact that one group has normalized a form of dehumanization, of degradation, does not mean that the other group should do the same just in the name of equalizing the ledger. Finally, I think one of the strangest features in this entire controversy is that somehow the conversation has become overwhelmingly about men, even though comparatively, men have had very little to say about it. I have seen some, plugging in their opinions, but comparatively, the men have not had a lot to say. And I find that asymmetry quite fascinating. I think one of the weakest arguments against the Haunting Adeline film adaptation, and by the way, I am wholly against it, but a weak argument is a weak argument, okay? One of the weakest arguments is that it will somehow give otherwise ordinary men, or latent predators, some reason to assault women. True gratification in defiling the human person, which I believe this has never required any artistic permission to prove itself apparent. I mean, any form of disordered desire, I think, has always had this extraordinary ingenuity in finding objects upon which to project itself. Those already inclined toward domination, toward abuse, toward crime, they seldom require a screenplay, okay, in order to justify it. I mean, you guys were talking about the types of people who, and I hate to use the word impressively, but genuinely, they have this impressive capability of recruiting almost anything into the service of appetites they already possess.
The idea that someone is going to watch this movie and then act out and do something because they've seen this movie is fucking stupid. They already have those thoughts. If someone wants to be a predator, they are going to be a predator. You will give them the excuse by saying this can happen, but they are going to do it regardless.
Consequently, I find the assertion that fiction in isolation manufactures predators to be an intellectually unpersuasive argument. Personally, I think you already have to have the itch inside of you to collapse criminal responsibility into media consumption, risks denying precisely the moral agency that makes guilt intelligible in the first place. That said, rejecting one reductionism does not automatically require embracing its opposite, okay? Art, like I said, does not deterministically produce evil. But I do think that repeated cultural rehearsal against toxic narratives, for whatever the intended purpose of the author, does require participation in this, in some moral ecology within which certain desires become increasingly aesthetic and emotionally normalized. And I'm just not convinced that it's to the most productive ends. Private preference only remains private until its cumulative effects actually start to become social, even if it just means that your audience is becoming more and more sympathetic to a quote-unquote empowering trajectory that only really begins once the toxic trajectory surrounding it becomes stomachable. Am I arguing, as some are, that people who enjoy, write, and promote fantasies are in some measure complicit? No, guys. Sorry, I have to say that now, because I know there are people who are gonna watch this and think that that's what I'm saying. No, that That is not what I'm saying. But it would be hard to deny that they are complicit in something. And for whatever that debated thing is, for whatever name we ultimately give that territory of influence, it is almost certainly not one in which human flourishing is advanced. So yeah, those are my thoughts for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm sorry I was a little bit yeah, I don't know. I feel like I had a bit of an attitude today, and so I apologize. I'm just tired. I'm so tired. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed. I will hopefully see you soon. If not, I don't know. We'll get there when we get there. Otherwise, you please take care of yourselves. And if there's anything in particular you'd like me to talk about, let me know. Otherwise, I always have something I'd like to talk to you guys about and get your opinions on. So yeah, you take care and goodbye.